This is a story of a blind stray dog named Shadow forms an unbreakable bond with Rusty, a street-smart terrier who becomes his guide and protector. Together, they survive the dangers of the streets, rescue abandoned puppies, and eventually find a loving home with kind-hearted Maggie. Their extraordinary journey inspires the creation of a sanctuary for special needs animals, where they help other broken souls heal. Welcome to Critters Planet, where heartwarming tales of animals and their extraordinary bonds take center stage. From heroic strays to unlikely animal friendships, we celebrate the resilience, love, and untold stories of creatures big and small. Join us as we explore the positive impact animals have on our world, one inspiring story at a time. The bitter winter air cut through the narrow alley like an invisible blade, whistling through cracks in the brick walls and sending discarded newspapers fluttering like wounded birds. In the deepest recess of this concrete canyon, where even the pale glow of distant streetlights dared not reach, a shadow stirred. Not a shadow cast by light, but one born of darkness itself. A black Labrador mix whose once glossy coat now hung in dull matted clumps over protruding ribs. His name was Shadow, though no human lips had spoken it in countless moons. Clouded eyes that saw nothing of the physical world darted nervously beneath heavy lids as another tremor racked his gaunt frame. The cold had long since seeped through, his thin fur settling deep into his bones until even his trembles came weakly, as if his body no longer had the energy for proper shivering. His nose, cracked and dry, twitched at the symphony of scents swirling through the alley. The acrid sting of urine marking some other creature's territory, the sickly sweet decay of week-old restaurant waste, and beneath it all, the ever-present, metallic tang of fear that seemed baked into these streets. A sudden crash of metal on concrete sent Shadow scrambling backward, his claws scraping desperately against the pavement as he tried to press himself into the very bricks at his back. Somewhere nearby, a dumpster lid had been knocked over, the echoes bouncing between buildings like gunshots to his hypersensitive ears. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, each exhale forming a tiny cloud that vanished almost before it appeared. The other strays had learned days ago that this alley's newest occupant couldn't see them coming, and they took cruel advantage, stealing what little food he managed to find, snapping at his haunches when he wandered too close to their claimed scraps. A particularly vicious gust of wind sent an empty soda can skittering across the pavement, its hollow rattle sending Shadow's heart into his throat. His mind flashed with half-remembered sensations, the warmth of a hand smoothing his fur, the low murmur of a voice saying, "Good boy, Shadow," the solid weight of a collar around his neck. But those memories were frayed at the edges now, worn, thin by months of survival. He didn't know why the car door had closed that final time without him, why the familiar scent had driven away and never returned. He only knew the crushing loneliness that followed. Rain began as a whisper, then grew into a relentless downpour that turned the alley floor into a shallow river of grime. Shadow tucked his nose beneath his tail, trying in vain to protect his sensitive nose from the stinging cold. Hunger gnawed at him with sharper teeth than the winter wind, but the thought of venturing out into the storm-filled darkness made his muscles lock with terror. At least here, wedged between the dumpster and the wall, he knew every smell, every echo. Out there lay only the unknown, speeding cars whose approach he couldn't see, hostile dogs whose growls he couldn't avoid, cruel humans who might kick. First and look later. The water pooling around his paws grew deeper, its icy fingers creeping up his legs. Shadow whimpered softly, a sound so quiet it barely disturbed the air before being swallowed by the storm. He was so tired, so impossibly tired. His head drooped lower, chin resting on wet concrete as his eyelids fluttered. Maybe if he just closed his eyes for a while, the cold wouldn't hurt so much. Maybe in his dreams, he could remember what sunlight felt like on his back, what it was like to feel safe. Somewhere in the drowning roar of the rain, a new sound emerged, the soft, uneven patter of approaching footsteps. Not the heavy tromp of human boots, but something lighter, more cautious. Shadow's head lifted a fraction, ears rotating like radar dishes. The scent hit him a moment later. Wet dog, yes, but beneath that, something warmer, something alive in a way nothing in this alley had been for a long time. A quiet whine escaped his throat before he could stop it, part warning, part plea. The footsteps paused, then slowly, deliberately, came the sound of something being pushed across the ground toward him. His nose twitched as rich, meaty aromas cut through the stench of garbage and rain. Food. Real food. Shadow's stomach clenched painfully, but he didn't move. Experience had taught him that kindness always came with hidden teeth. The silence stretched, broken only by the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, soft as the brush of a falling leaf, came a sound he hadn't heard in longer than he could remember, the gentle, questioning woof of another dog speaking without aggression. Somewhere deep in Shadow's chest, beneath layers of fear and learned distrust, a tiny ember of hope flickered to life. The meaty aroma grew stronger, cutting through the alley's stale odors like a knife. Shadow's nostrils flared as saliva flooded his mouth, his empty stomach clenching painfully. Yet he remained frozen, his muscles coiled tight with instinctive wariness. Food never came without cost in this world. The unseen dog made no move to approach. Instead, Shadow heard the soft scuff of paws retreating several steps, leaving the offering between them. A quiet, patient whine followed, not the demanding growl of a dominant stray marking territory, but something gentler, almost encouraging. Slowly, trembling with more than just cold, Shadow uncurled from his defensive ball. His nose led him forward an inch at a time, whiskers brushing wet concrete until they touched something warm and solid. A chunk of discarded sausage, barely touched. His first cautious lick sent fireworks of flavor across his tongue. Before he could stop himself, he'd wolfed it down in 2 desperate gulps, a soft click of claws on pavement. Shadow tensed, expecting attack or theft, but the other dog simply sat down just beyond reach, breathing quietly. Up close, his scent was complex. Old injuries and hard living, yes, but none of the aggressive pheromones Shadow had learned to fear. Instead, there was something earthy and warm beneath the rain-soaked fur, like sun-baked grass in some long-forgotten summer. "You're blind." The words weren't spoken aloud, but conveyed through a series of gentle sniffs and subtle body shifts. That street dogs understood as clearly as human speech. Shadow instinctively turned his head away from where the voice seemed to originate, ashamed. Weakness was dangerous here. A sudden warmth pressed against his flank as the other dog circled behind him. Shadow nearly bolted, being approached from. His blind spot triggered every survival instinct, but then he felt teeth, not biting but gently grasping the scruff of his neck in the way mother dogs guided puppies. "Come." The terrier mix, for Shadow could now tell he was smaller but sturdier, tugged just enough to indicate direction. When Shadow hesitated, the dog released him and walked a few paces away, stopping to wait. An invitation, not a demand. Rain dripped from both their coats as Shadow wrestled with instinct. Every lesson of the street screamed that trusting meant dying, but the terrier's patience felt different from the harsh indifference of the city. And the gnawing void in Shadow's chest, the one that had nothing to do with hunger, ached at the thought of returning to solitude. One trembling step. Then another. The terrier made an approving sound deep in his throat and moved forward, his limping gait leaving a clear audio trail to follow. Through the alley's labyrinth they wove, the terrier pausing whenever Shadow's uncertainty made him. "Stole? Here." The space beneath the fire escape was dry, protected by overhanging scaffolding. Old blankets and shredded newspaper formed a crude nest, clearly someone's long-established shelter. Shadow froze at the threshold, recognizing the scent markers of claimed territory. The terrier circled back and nudged him forward. Shared. As Shadow sank into the unexpected comfort of dry bedding, the terrier settled beside him, close, but not touching. Up close, Shadow could hear the hitch in his breathing, some old injury or illness lingering in his lungs. He smelled infection beneath the fur where the limp originated. Why? Shadow's entire body tensed after the implied question, bracing for the inevitable demand of payment. The terrier yawned, his breath warm and meat-scented. "Saw you stumble into old Tom's territory last moon. Knew you wouldn't last the winter." A pause. "I'm Rusty." The name hung between them like a offered paw. Shadow remained silent, but slowly, hesitantly allowed his body to relax until his damp fur just brushed Rusty's side. The warmth was intoxicating. Somewhere in the night, a siren wailed. Rusty's ear twitched toward the sound, but he didn't stir. Shadow, attuned to every vibration, felt the terrier's steady heartbeat against his ribs. For the first time since the car drove away, Shadow didn't feel entirely alone. Dawn crept into the makeshift shelter like a cautious intruder, its pale fingers tracing the edges of rusted scaffolding before daring to touch the two sleeping dogs. Shadow awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar warmth pressed against his back. Then memory returned. Rusty, the food, the dry shelter. His ears swiveled nervously as he realized the terrier was no longer beside him. A soft clatter of claws on metal came from above. Shadow tilted his head upward, his clouded eyes searching uselessly as his nose caught Rusty's scent descending the fire escape's trembling steps. Something moist and heavy dropped near his front paws. "Eat," Rusty panted, his tongue lolling from the exertion of climbing with his bad leg. Fresh from the butcher's back step, Shadow sniffed the offering, a chunk of grisly meat still wrapped in bloody paper. His stomach roared to life, but he hesitated. "You hunted this?" "Stole it," Rusty corrected cheerfully, shaking rain from his scruffy coat. But the butcher's cat was napping. Easy mark. As Shadow devoured the meat, he detected subtle shifts in Rusty's breathing, each inhale slightly labored, each exhale carrying a faint wheeze. The terrier was trying to hide his discomfort, but a blind dog notices what others overlook. "You're hurt," Shadow mumbled between bites. Rusty snorted. "I'm old. Difference is, one gets better." He nudged the last scrap toward Shadow. "Finish it. You'll need strength today for what, your first lesson?" The alley had transformed overnight. Puddles from the storm reflected slices of sky, creating a minefield of deceptive surfaces that Rusty guided Shadow around with gentle shoulder checks. The terrier moved differently now, louder, more deliberately, his limp exaggerated to create a distinct sound signature. "Listen," Rusty said, stopping abruptly. Shadow nearly bumped into him. "Hear that?" A rhythmic dripping echoed from the left. "Water? Broken pipe. Means the ground slopes there. Step wrong and you'll slide into the rat nests." Rusty demonstrated by scuffing his paw along the edge of a depression Shadow hadn't detected. "Now you try." Shadow's first attempts were clumsy. He misjudged distances, tripped over uneven pavement, and once nearly brained himself on a low-hanging sign. But Rusty never lost patience. When Shadow veered too close to danger, the terrier would block his path with his own body, or give a sharp chee-choo sound they quickly established meant stop immediately. By midday, Shadow could navigate 3 connected alleys using Rusty's cues and newly discovered landmarks. The musky scent of a particular dumpster marked the halfway point, while the hum of a malfunctioning neon sign signaled their turn back toward shelter. "Not bad," Rusty allowed as they rested beneath the fire escape. "For a blind lump." Shadow huffed but didn't protest the nickname. His paws ached and his nose felt raw from overuse, but something unfamiliar bubbled in his chest. It took him 3 shared breaths to recognize it. Pride. The lesson nearly turned tragic at dusk. Shadow was practicing identifying objects by scent alone when Rusty suddenly stiffened beside him. A new smell flooded the alley, chemical and artificial, masking something darker beneath. "Human," Rusty growled low in his throat. "Not the kind woman, dangerous." Before Shadow could react, a rock skittered near his paws, then another, this one striking his shoulder with bruising force. "Look at that," slurred a male voice. "Mutt can't even see where the rock's coming from." Laughter, the stench of alcohol. More projectiles raining down. Shadow crouched, paralyzed by memories of similar attacks, the sharp pain, the mocking voices, the helplessness. A snarl unlike any sound he'd heard from Rusty split the air. "Run!" the terrier barked in dog language. But instead of fleeing, he charged toward the threat. Chaos erupted. Human shouts, the sound of a kick connecting. Rusty yelping but immediately attacking again. Shadow stood trembling, useless, until a guttural canine war cry burst from his own throat. He barreled forward, following Rusty's sounds and the humans'. Startled curses, his shoulder collided with denim-clad legs. The man staggered back, swearing, then fled when both dogs advanced. Only when the footsteps faded did Rusty's bravado collapse. He limped badly now, breathing in shallow gasps. "Why?" Shadow pressed against him, checking for injuries. "You could have run." Rusty licked at a cut on his foreleg. "Partners don't run," he said simply. The word hung between them, glowing like embers in the gathering dark. Shadow carefully groomed the spot behind Rusty's ear, where the fur was matted with blood. The terrier tolerated it for exactly 3 licks before playfully shoving him away. "Save your energy," Rusty said, rising stiffly. "Tomorrow we tackle stairs." Shadow fell into step beside his guide, their shoulders brushing with each stride. For the first time since the world went dark, he didn't feel like a broken thing. He felt like part of something whole. The moon hung like a cataract-clouded eye over the city as Rusty led Shadow through unfamiliar territory. The usual nighttime sounds were different here, fewer rattling dumpsters, more hollow echoes bouncing off brick walls. Shadow's paws tingled with unease as they entered what smelled like an abandoned industrial yard, the air thick with rust and oil. "Where?" Shadow began, but Rusty silenced him with a sharp nudge to the ribs. "Quiet," Rusty breathed against his ear. "Listen." Then Shadow heard it, a faint, high-pitched whimpering from somewhere ahead. Not canine, smaller, more desperate. Rusty's tail thumped once against Shadow's leg. "Puppies. In the drain pipe." The metal pipe jutted from the ground at a cruel angle, its opening barely wide enough for Rusty to squeeze through. The whimpers grew louder as they approached, mingled with the sickly sweet smell of infection. Shadow's nose wrinkled at the underlying stench of neglect. "Mother?" Shadow asked, scanning the darkness for any sign of protection. "Gone," Rusty said simply. 3 days gone by the smell. A tiny, trembling voice echoed from the pipe. "Help!" Rusty didn't hesitate. He wriggled into the pipe, his bad leg dragging, awkwardly. Shadow heard scraping sounds, then a pained yip as Rusty clearly aggravated his old injury. Moments later, the terrier emerged backward, gently dragging a squirming bundle by the scruff. One by one, Rusty extracted 3 puppies. The first 2 wiggled weakly, but stood on unsteady legs. The third lay motionless in Shadow's paws, its breathing shallow. "Too late for that one," Rusty murmured, but Shadow was already doing what instinct demanded, licking the tiny body vigorously, stimulating circulation as he'd seen mother dogs do. To his surprise, Rusty joined in, their tongues moving in unison until the puppy gasped and began mewling. Shadow's chest swelled with something warmer than pride as the revived pup nuzzled against him. "They're coming with us," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Rusty opened his mouth, likely to list all the reasons this was a terrible idea, when a new sound froze them both. The unmistakable creak of leather and jingle of metal tags. Animal control. The humans approached from upwind, their boots crunching on broken glass. Shadow instinctively curled around the puppies, his mind racing. A blind dog and a crippled terrier. Couldn't outrun trained officers. Couldn't fight. Couldn't... "Take them," Rusty growled, shoving the puppies toward Shadow. "Follow my exact path. Don't stop for anything." Before Shadow could protest, Rusty was gone, streaking away in the opposite direction with an explosive volley of barks. The humans shouted, their footsteps giving chase. "Rusty!" Shadow whispered fiercely, but already his friend's sounds were fading. The puppies trembled against him. Then he heard it, a rhythmic scraping from the left. The same sound Rusty made, dragging his bad leg when he wanted to be followed. Shadow gathered 2 pups in his mouth by their scruffs, nudging the third to cling to his neck fur. Then he moved, each step measured and precise, tracking Rusty's trail of scent and sound through the industrial maze. The terrier's path was genius, under low fences where humans couldn't follow, through narrow gaps between buildings, always, pausing just long enough for Shadow to catch up before moving again. Twice, Shadow had to stop completely as searchlights swept nearby, the puppies holding their breath against his fur. After an eternity, Rusty's scent grew stronger. Shadow rounded a corner and nearly collided with the panting terrier. "Lost them," Rusty gasped, his tongue lolling. "For now." The reunion was cut short by a weak whimper from the smallest puppy. Rusty sniffed it carefully, his ears flattening. That one won't last the night without help. Shadow felt the puppy's shallow breathing against his paw. "The kind woman," he said suddenly, "the one who leaves food." Rusty's eyes narrowed. "Too risky." "You once told me partners don't run," Shadow countered. "Partners also don't let puppies die." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the puppy's whines. Finally, Rusty sighed. "We go at first. Slight, but when this goes wrong—" "When?" Shadow interrupted. "It goes right, you owe me a steak." Dawn found them outside a weathered blue house, the porch smelling of lavender and that particular human Rusty called the kind woman. Shadow kept the puppies pressed between himself and a hydrangea bush while Rusty approached the door. What happened next unfolded in sounds and scents for Shadow. The creak of a screen door, a woman's gasp. "Oh, you're that little limping dog from—" Rusty's deliberate bark 3 times sharp, their agreed signal. Shadow nudged the puppies forward, his heart hammering. The smallest one stumbled, its weak cry unmistakable. "Oh my God," the woman whispered. Footsteps on wood, then the rustle of fabric as she knelt. Warm hands, gentle but confident, scooped up the puppies. Shadow tensed, ready to intervene if needed, but the woman's scent held no deception, only concern. A pause. Then fingers brushed Shadow's head. "You beautiful, brave dogs," she murmured, her voice thick. "Come inside, all of you." Rusty's tail thumped against Shadow's leg once, the unspoken message clear. Together. As they crossed the threshold into warmth and safety, Shadow felt Rusty's shoulder pressed firmly against his own, not guiding, not protecting, just being there. The first step of many. The scent of antiseptic burned Shadow's nose as he lay on the softest surface he'd felt in years, what the kind woman called a dog bed. The puppies, now clean and full of warm milk, slept in a wriggling pile against his belly. Rusty's familiar wheeze came from his left side, though it sounded different now, clearer after the woman had cleaned his infected leg. "Think she'll let us stay?" Shadow whispered, careful not to disturb the sleeping pups. Rusty shifted uncomfortably. "Humans always want something." A floorboard creaked. The woman's lavender and soap scent approached. Shadow felt gentle fingers trace the scar tissue around his eyes. "You poor baby," she murmured. Her voice sounded wet, like she'd been crying. "What monster would abandon a blind dog?" Rusty's growl vibrated through the dog bed. Shadow nudged him silent. Her name was Maggie. Shadow learned this through repetition, as she spoke to them constantly in her musical voice. While filling water bowls, "Here you go, boys." While applying salve to Rusty's leg, "This'll help, tough guy." And especially when cradling the weakest. Puppy against her chest at night, "Hang in there, little warrior." On the third morning, new scents invaded the house, chemical cleanliness and starched fabric. "Vet's here," Maggie announced nervously. Rusty immediately positioned himself between Shadow and the door, his ragged ears flat. The puppies whimpered at the tension. The vet moved differently than Maggie. Efficient strides, clipped breathing. Shadow smelled medicine and thousands of other animals on her. When her hands examined his eyes, they were clinical but not unkind. "Retinal detachment," she told Maggie. "Probably from trauma, and this one—" Her fingers found Rusty's shoulder. "Old fracture healed wrong, must cause constant pain." Shadow turned sharply toward Rusty, who avoided his gaze. The vet lowered. Her voice, "They're clearly bonded. If you're keeping one—" "I'm keeping them all," Maggie interrupted. The finality in her voice made Shadow's tail thump involuntarily. That night after the vet left and the puppies slept in their new crate, Rusty paced the kitchen's perimeter obsessively. "You're in pain," Shadow accused. Rusty snorted. "We're dogs." "Pain's part of the deal." Shadow blocked his path. "You protected me all this time. Let me help now." For once, Rusty had no sarcastic reply. He simply pressed his forehead against Shadow's shoulder, a gesture of trust so profound it left them both trembling. The real test came 2 weeks later. Maggie had begun training sessions, teaching them words like sit and wait using bits. Rov chicken. Shadow excelled at these games, his sharp hearing catching every subtle shift in her tone. Rusty tolerated them, though he never fully relaxed indoors. Then came the afternoon the back door blew open in a gust of wind. Shadow heard the crash, then the puppies' panicked squeals as they bolted into the unfenced yard, toward the busy street beyond. Maggie shouted, but Shadow was already moving, Rusty half a step ahead. Chaos unfolded in a blur of scents and sounds, the shriek of brakes, Maggie screaming, "No!" Rusty's battle cry as he herded the pups away from the road. Shadow didn't think. He flowed into the space between danger and the puppies, his body becoming a living barrier. A bicycle swerved wildly, its rider cursing as Shadow stood unflinching. Then Rusty was beside him, shoulder to shoulder, as they corralled the pups back toward the house. Maggie fell to her knees, gathering them all into a shaking embrace. Later, after the adrenaline faded, Shadow found Rusty staring out the window. "Still think humans want something from us?" Shadow teased. Rusty watched Maggie sob into her phone. "They saved the puppies, Mom." His tail gave a single tentative wag. "Maybe we want something from them too," he admitted. Shadow bumped against him gently. The streetlights outside painted golden stripes across their backs, two stray souls, no longer alone in the dark. The jingle of the collar tag still felt foreign against Shadow's neck. He turned his head sharply at the sound, momentarily confusing it for one of Maggie's wind chimes. Beside him, Rusty grumbled as he scratched at the blue fabric around his own throat. "Quit fidgeting," Shadow muttered. "Easy for you to say," Rusty shot back. "You can't see how ridiculous we look." Maggie laughed from the kitchen, her footsteps light as she approached. Shadow felt her fingers brush between his ears, a gesture that no longer made him flinch. "You two are the handsomest boys on the block," she cooed. Rusty huffed, but leaned into her touch. The terrier would never admit it, but Shadow knew he'd grown fond of Maggie's scratches. A sharp knock at the door shattered the peaceful moment. Shadow's nose twitched as unfamiliar scents flooded in, sweat, cheap cologne, and something metallic that set his teeth on edge. Rusty went rigid beside him, a low growl building in his chest. "Easy," Maggie murmured, but Shadow heard the tremor in her voice. The man at the door spoke in greasy tones that made Shadow's hackles rise. "Afternoon, ma'am. Just checking if you've seen this dog around." Paper rustled. Maggie's breath hitched. That's Rusty," she said carefully. The stranger's scent spiked with triumph. "Sure is. My Rusty. Ran off months ago after some kids left my gate open." Shadow felt Rusty begin to tremble, not with fear, but with barely contained fury. The terrier's breathing came in short, ragged bursts. "That's impossible," Maggie said. "I found him as a stray. He was injured, half-starved." "Like I said," the man interrupted, his voice hardening. "Ran off. Got the papers to prove ownership." Shadow pressed against Rusty's side and inhaled deeply. Beneath the cologne, he caught it, the faintest whiff of something rancid clinging to the man's clothes, the same scent that sometimes made Rusty wake up snarling from nightmares. Maggie's fingers tangled in Rusty's scruff. "I'd like to see those papers." While the man fumbled in his jacket, Shadow detected three crucial details. The man's shoes squeaked, brand new, not the worn boots of someone who'd been searching for a lost pet for months. His scent carried no trace of dog hair or kibble, only motor oil and stale cigarettes. When he reached toward Rusty, his hand shook slightly. Not with emotion, but with something darker. Rusty bared his teeth in a silent snarl. Shadow had never seen him like this, every muscle coiled to attack, yet restrained by some last thread of control. The man produced a folded document. "See? Registered to me, Hank Rollins." Maggie scanned the paper. "This says you own a 3-year-old female beagle." A beat of silence. Then, "Damn paperwork mix-up," the man, Hank, growled. "Look, lady, that's my dog." Shadow felt the change in Rusty before it happened. The subtle shift from fear to fury. The terrier lunged forward with a roar that shook the windows. Only Maggie's grip on his collar prevented him from sinking teeth into Hank's thigh. Hank stumbled, back, his facade cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. "Vicious bastard, just like always." The words hung in the air like poison. Maggie went very still. "You?" she said quietly. Need to leave. Now. The confrontation lasted another 10 minutes. Threats about animal control, claims about legal action, and finally, Hank's retreat when Maggie threatened to call the police. When the door finally closed, Rusty collapsed onto his belly, panting violently. Shadow nosed at him worriedly, picking up the sour tang of adrenaline and old terror. Maggie knelt between them, her hands shaking as she stroked both dogs. "It's okay," she whispered, more to herself than them. "He's gone." But Shadow knew better. Men like Hank didn't stay gone. That night, under cover of darkness, Shadow lay awake listening to Rusty's restless pacing. The terrier's claws clicked against hardwood in a frantic rhythm. "Tell me," Shadow said simply. Rusty stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Then, "Wasn't always a stray," Rusty began, his voice rough. "Puppy mill first, then him." The story came out in fractured pieces between Rusty's teeth. The tiny cage, the training with a shock collar, the bad leg, not an accident, but punishment for failing to attack on command. Shadow listened without interrupting, his own breath coming faster as the pieces fell into place. Rusty hadn't just escaped, he'd been left for dead after a particularly brutal lesson. "He recognized me today," Rusty finished bitterly. "Not because he missed me, because he misses what I could do for him." Shadow pressed his flank against Rusty's. The terrier was trembling. "We won't let him take you," Shadow vowed. Rusty gave a hollow laugh. "You don't know men like him. They always—" A sound outside cut him off. The scrape of shoes on gravel, the creak of the gate hinge Maggie always forgot to oil, and worst of all, the unmistakable click of a pistol's safety being switched off. Shadow was on his feet in an instant, his lips peeling back from his teeth. Rusty stood frozen beside him, caught between fight and flight. Then the kitchen window shattered. The gunshot cracked through the night like frozen wood splitting. Shadow felt the concussion ripple through his body before the sound even registered. Glass rained down around them as Maggie screamed, a raw primal sound Shadow had never heard from her before. Rusty reacted first. With a snarl that seemed to tear from his very soul, the terrier launched himself at the broken window. Shadow caught his scruff at the last second, yanking him back as another bullet punched into the ceiling. Plaster dust snowed down around them. "Not that way," Shadow growled. Even through his terror, his mind worked frantically. Hank would expect them to flee through the door. They needed surprise. Maggie was already moving, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she grabbed both dogs' collars. "Basement," she choked out. "Now." Another shot. This one shattered the vase on the entry table. The one Maggie kept filled with sunflowers. The scent of gunpowder and broken stems filled the air as they scrambled toward the basement stairs. The darkness below was absolute. Shadow heard Maggie fumbling for something, then the metallic snick of a deadbolt sliding home. Her fingers trembled as she pulled them deeper into the musty space. "He'll circle to the back," Rusty panted. "Knows the layout, used to case houses before." Shadow didn't need him to finish. He pressed against Maggie's shaking legs, whining low in his throat. Her hands found his face, then Rusty's. "I won't let him take you," she whispered, echoing Shadow's own vow. The irony wasn't lost on him. The human now protecting the strays, who'd once protected her. Upstairs, heavy boots kicked in the front door. What followed was a nightmare of sound and scent, wood splintering as Hank tore through cabinets, the puppies whimpering upstairs. Maggie had left them sleeping in their crate. Hank's voice, thick with liquor and rage. Come out, you little traitor." Shadow felt Rusty's muscles coiling like springs beside him. The terrier's breathing had gone eerily calm, the stillness before the strike. Maggie's phone buzzed silently in her pocket. The police. They were coming. But not soon enough. A floorboard creaked directly overhead. Hank was standing right above them. Rusty looked at Shadow. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then, "Keep her safe." Before Shadow could react, Rusty bolted up the stairs, his claws scrabbling on wood. The basement door crashed open. Hank's triumphant shout, a scuffle. Then, silence. Shadow lunged forward, but Maggie held him back with surprising strength. "No," she hissed. "He's drawing him away." The truth hit Shadow like a physical blow. Rusty was sacrificing himself. Again, the gunshot, when it came, was muffled by distance. Shadow howled. The sound tore from someplace deeper than his lungs, a primordial cry of grief that shook the basement walls. Maggie sobbed into his fur, her tears hot against his neck. Then, miraculously, the faintest answering bark from outside. Shadow went rigid. He knew that sound, Rusty's all-clear signal from their alley days. But how? Maggie's phone buzzed. Again. This time she answered in a whisper. "He's here. Hank Rollins. He has a gun. He just..." A thunderous knock at the front door. "Police! Anyone home?" Chaos erupted upstairs, cursing, more breaking glass, then the blessed wail of sirens. Shadow strained against Maggie's grip until she finally released him, both of them charging up the stairs into devastation. The kitchen looked like a war zone. Cabinets hung broken. Flour and sugar coated every surface where bags had been slashed. Open. And there, by the shattered back door, Rusty. Shadow barreled across the room, nearly slipping in something wet and metallic smelling. Blood. But whose? The terrier lay panting by the threshold, his flank heaving. Shadow frantically nosed along his body, searching for wounds. To his shock, he found none. "Not mine," Rusty wheezed. "His." Then Shadow understood. Rusty had lured Hank outside, right into the path of the arriving police. The coppery scent clinging to Rusty's teeth told the rest of the story. Maggie collapsed. Beside them, her arms encircling both dogs as flashing lights painted the walls blue and red. "You crazy, brilliant boys," she wept into their fur. Dawn found them at the emergency vet clinic, all three miraculously unharmed. The puppies, safely, hidden during the attack, now climbed over their exhausted protectors. The police had taken Hank away in handcuffs, his calf bandaged where Rusty's teeth had found their mark. His criminal record, including multiple animal cruelty charges, meant he wouldn't be bothering them again. Maggie stroked Rusty's ears as the terrier finally relaxed into sleep. "You're safe now," she murmured. "Really safe." Shadow watched the sunrise through the clinic windows. Not with his eyes, but by the way the light warmed his fur and made Rusty's red coat glow like embers. The winter had been harsh. The struggle wasn't over. But as Shadow curled around his family, his strange, wonderful, chosen family, he realized something profound. Some bonds are forged in darkness so they can shine brightest in the light. The first snowflakes of winter spiraled down as Maggie's car crunched along the shelters. Gravel driveway. Shadow pressed his nose against the cool window glass, his breath fogging the surface as unfamiliar scents flooded his nostrils. Bleach, anxiety, and beneath it all, the unmistakable musk of abandoned animals. Rusty shifted uneasily in the back seat beside the puppy's carrier. "Told you we shouldn't have come," he muttered. Maggie's fingers brushed Shadow's head. "It's just for the afternoon, boys. The shelter director wants to meet you." Shadow didn't understand why they'd been brought to this place that smelled of sorrow and metal cages. But when the car door opened, he followed trustingly, his shoulder pressed against Rusty's flank. The shelter's interior was a symphony of barking and meows that set Shadow's ears twitching. A new voice approached, lemon-scented perfume and sensible shoes. "These are the heroes?" the woman asked. Maggie's laugh sounded nervous. "Shadow and Rusty. Meet Director Callahan. She runs the rescue." A hand extended toward Shadow. He sniffed, cautiously. No trace of fear, just curiosity and something else. "Or..." "We've been following your story since the news coverage," Director Callahan said. "A blind dog and his protector saving those puppies, then taking down an abusive owner?" She knelt until her face was level with theirs. "You two are extraordinary." Rusty huffed, but Shadow detected the subtle wag in his tail. They were led to a large room where strange rhythmic thumping echoed off the walls. Shadow cocked his head. It sounded like dozens of tails hitting the floor simultaneously. "These are our long-term residents," Director Callahan explained. "Dogs no one wants. Too old, too injured, too..." Her voice caught. "Broken." The scent that hit Shadow then nearly buckled his knees. Not just despair, but something sharper. Recognition. These dogs smelled like he and Rusty once had, like the alley, like hopelessness. A particularly pungent odor made Shadow turn, urine, and infection with an undercurrent of defiance. That's Brutus, the director sighed. Pitbull mix, 3 years in the system. People think he's aggressive, but Shadow didn't wait for permission. He followed the scent to its source. A large dog whose rapid heartbeat betrayed his tough guy growls. Without hesitation, Shadow pressed his nose through the cage bars. The pitbull froze. "Shadow, no!" Maggie gasped. But Shadow remained still, letting Brutus sniff him thoroughly. After a tense moment, the pitbull's breathing slowed. Then, the miraculous sound of a tail thumping once against concrete. Director Callahan made a strange choking sound. "He's never. That dog hasn't let anyone near him in..." Rusty trotted up beside Shadow. "What's your game?" he whispered. Shadow turned his unseeing eyes toward the other cages. "They're like we were." Understanding flashed between them. Without another word, Rusty moved to the next enclosure, a trembling chihuahua missing an eye. The terrier lay down. Just outside the bars, his posture relaxed but watchful. An hour later, Maggie and the director watched in stunned silence as the shelter's problem cases transformed. Shadow moved from cage to cage, his quiet presence calming even the most fearful dogs. Rusty worked differently, challenging the aggressive ones with playful bows until they tentatively wagged their tails. Director Callahan wiped her eyes. "I've never seen anything like this." Maggie's voice was thick. "They understand brokenness because they've been broken too." A plan took shape as the dogs worked. Shadow, with his uncanny ability to connect with the traumatized. Rusty, with his street-smart toughness that commanded respect. Together, they could reach dogs no human ever could. That evening, as Maggie loaded them back into the car, Director Callahan handed her a business card. "We'd like to sponsor them," she said firmly. "Official shelter ambassadors, training sessions, maybe even a program for..." "Unadoptable dogs," Maggie finished softly. The director smiled. "I was going to say, dogs who just need the right friends." Rusty snorted as the car door closed. "We're not mascots." Shadow nudged him gently. "No, we're guides." As the engine rumbled to life, Shadow pictured the alley where they'd met. Darkness, the hunger, the desperate loneliness. Then he thought of Brutus and the others, still waiting in their cages. The car turned toward home, but Shadow's mind raced ahead. They'd walked the path from broken to whole. Now they could light the way for others. Rusty seemed to read his thoughts. With a sigh that was only half exasperated, the terrier rested his chin on Shadow's back. "Guess we're not done saving strays yet." Shadow closed his eyes, not in blindness, but in contentment. The snow continued falling outside, but inside the car warmth radiated between them, melting the last icy shards of their past. The scent of antiseptic and anxious dogs grew familiar over the following weeks. Each morning, Maggie would buckle Shadow and Rusty into their special harnesses, Rusty's with Ambassador stitched in bold letters, Shadow's with Guide Dog for the Lost, and drive them to the shelter. Today, however, something was different. Shadow's nose twitched as they entered the building. Beneath the usual smells lingered something new. Coffee, expensive perfume, and the sharp tang of electronic equipment. "News crews here," Rusty muttered, his shoulder pressing against Shadow's. Camera by the wall. Big light set up near Brutus's cage. Director Callahan's heels clicked toward them. "Boys, perfect timing. The Chronicle wants to document your work with our new arrival." A small hand touched Shadow's head. "This is the blind one?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, Lisa," Maggie answered tightly. "And he's not the blind one, and he's Shadow." The new arrival turned out to be a skeletal greyhound crammed into the smallest exam room. The stench of neglect rolled off him in waves, infected sores, matted, fur, and beneath it all the sour milk smell of utter defeat. "Race name Lightning Bolt," Director Callahan said quietly. "Retired at 2 years old when he broke his hock. Owner tried to..." She trailed off, but Shadow's sensitive ears caught the vet's whispered, "Euthanize him themselves." Rusty growled. Low in his throat, Shadow approached slowly, his nails clicking on the stainless steel table. The greyhound didn't lift his head, but his nostrils flared as Shadow drew near. "Hey, Lightning," Shadow whispered, using the name he'd heard. A faint tremor ran through the greyhound's body. "Not lightning," he corrected hoarsely. "Bolt." Shadow recognized that voice, the hollow tone of a creature who'd given up. He'd worn it himself once. Without hesitation, he pressed his forehead against Bolt's. "Okay, Bolt." What followed was a delicate dance witnessed by cameras and tearful humans. Shadow stayed glued to Bolt's side as the vet cleaned his wounds, distracting him with quiet chatter about treats and sunny spots for napping. Rusty positioned himself between Bolt and the door, his steady presence preventing panic when strangers moved too close. And when Bolt finally trembled too violently to stand, Shadow did something extraordinary. He lay down first, inviting the larger dog to rest against him. Director Callahan's breath hitched. That's exactly how wild canines behave with pack members in distress. Lisa, the reporter, stopped taking notes. How does a blind dog know to do that? Maggie's answer came softly. Because he remembers. The real test came at bath time. Bolt had never been properly bathed. Track dogs were hosed down in kennel runs. The moment running water sounded, he scrambled backward, his injured leg buckling. Rusty moved first, planting himself squarely under the spray. Water darkened his russet fur as he looked pointedly at Bolt. "See, not poison." Shadow approached from the opposite side. "Remember the alley after rain? Smelled like this." Slowly, with both dogs flanking him, Bolt allowed himself to be led into the shallow tub. The photographer captured the moment his ears finally relaxed, the exact instant he stopped being a broken racer and started being just a dog. That evening, as Maggie drove them home, the car was unusually quiet. Even the puppies seemed to sense the day's gravity, sleeping soundly in their carrier. "You know," Maggie finally said, rubbing Rusty's ear, "we could foster Bolt, if you boys want." Shadow turned the idea over in his mind. Another dog in there. Safe haven. Another life changed. He bumped his nose against Rusty's, seeking his opinion. The terrier sighed dramatically. "Guess the couch is big enough for 3. Maggie's laughter filled the car, warmer than any heater. As they pulled into the driveway, Shadow realized something wonderful. This wasn't just rescue work anymore, it was family. The first night with Bolt in the house unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of discomfort. The greyhound stood frozen in the doorway, his bony frame trembling as unfamiliar home scents assaulted his senses. Lemon furniture polish, Maggie's. Lavender shampoo, the lingering aroma of last night's meatloaf. Shadow nudged past him, deliberately scuffing his paws on the welcome mat. "Wood floors here," he announced. "Slippery if you run." Bolt's ears twitched toward the sound. "I don't run anymore." Rusty snorted from his favorite spot on the couch. "Good, because this is a no-racing zone." Dinner proved challenging. Bolt stared at the full bowl of kibble like it might bite him first. "Eat," Rusty commanded around a mouthful of his own food. The greyhound lowered his head submissively. Not allowed until Maggie made a soft, heartbroken sound. She knelt and hand-fed Bolt one piece at a time, her fingers trembling. Shadow pressed against her knee, sharing his warmth as she whispered, "You can eat whenever you're hungry now." Midnight revealed the real trauma. Shadow awoke to the sound of claws scrabbling on hardwood. Bolt was sleep-running, his legs churning through phantom races, his breath coming in panicked whines. Before Shadow could react, Rusty was there, positioning. His body as a living barrier between Bolt and the wall. "Wake up, speed demon!" Rusty grunted, bracing as Bolt collided with him. The greyhound came to himself with a gasp. "I was back there. Yeah, well, you're here now." Rusty licked Bolt's muzzle once, roughly. "Go drink some water." Shadow marveled at the transformation. The street-hardened terrier, who once trusted no one, now guiding another lost soul. Days blurred into a routine of healing. Mornings began with Bolt learning to navigate stairs, his damaged leg requiring slow, careful movements, with Shadow leading the way. Afternoons were for rehabilitation at the shelter, where Shadow and Rusty's presence calmed even the most terrified. New arrivals. Evenings ended with all 3 dogs piled together in front of the fireplace, Bolt's nose gradually losing its anxious wrinkles as he absorbed the sense of home. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. A new scent at the shelter stopped Shadow in his tracks, something sharp and medicinal beneath layers of fear. He turned his head toward isolation room 3. Who's that? Director Callahan's hand trembled slightly as she stroked his head. A special case. Seizure dog surrendered when his owner passed. He's not adjusting well. Rusty sniffed beneath the door. Smells like grief. The Labrador inside didn't bark or growl. The silence was worse. The utter stillness of a creature who'd given up. Shadow recognized that silence. It was the sound before he'd met Rusty. "Can we?" Shadow asked simply. The dog called Samson lifted his head listlessly when they entered. His chocolate coat was dull, his once muscular frame gaunt from days without eating. But it was his eyes that struck Shadow most. Though he couldn't see them, he sensed their emptiness through the way Samson barely reacted to their presence. Rusty circled the room once before declaring, "Military trained. See how he tracks sounds even depressed?" Shadow approached slowly, stopping just outside Samson's personal space. "I'm Shadow." No response. "My human died too," Shadow continued softly. "Left me in a parking lot when I went blind." Samson's breath hitched. Rusty added matter-of-factly, "I got left for dead after chewing through my chains." For 10 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then Samson's tail thumped once against the floor. Just once. But it was enough. That night, Maggie found 3 dogs waiting by the car instead of 2. Director Callahan wrung her hands. "I know it's sudden, but..." Maggie was already opening the back door. "Hop in, Samson." The ride home was different, with the big lab taking up most of the seat. Bolt seemed unsure at first, then intrigued by Samson's disciplined calm. By the time they pulled into the driveway, Samson was gently correcting Bolt's posture to ease his bad leg. Rusty watched the interaction with something almost like pride. "Well," he told Shadow, "looks like we're not the only teachers anymore." Shadow smiled as Samson guided Bolt up the porch steps with quiet commands. The cycle continued, broken souls mending each other in ways no human ever could. As they settled into their now crowded living room, Maggie snapped a picture of the 4 dogs, tangled together on what was once her couch. Caption practically wrote itself, "Home is where the pack is." The first frost glittered on Maggie's windshield as she turned the car down an unfamiliar gravel road. Shadow sat up straighter, his nose pressed to the cracked window. The scents here were different: open fields, hay, and beneath it all, the musky perfume of dozens of dogs. Rusty's claws tapped nervously against the seat. "This isn't the shelter." In the back seat, Bolt and Samson perked up, their confusion palpable. The puppies, now nearly full-grown, whined in their crate. Maggie's fingers trembled on the steering wheel. "Surprise," she said weakly. The sign creaked in the winter wind as they pulled up. Second Chance Ranch. Below it, a smaller plaque read, "Special Needs Animal Sanctuary. Coming Spring. 2024. Shadow inhaled sharply. The property hummed with potential. The big farmhouse with its wraparound porch, the partially converted barn, the sprawling fenced fields. But what made his tail wag uncontrollably were the subtle details. The gently sloping paths perfect for blind dogs, the extra-wide doorways, the absence of any sharp corners near the feeding stations. This place had been designed for them. Director Callahan emerged from the farmhouse, her usual crisp suit replaced by jeans and work boots. "Took you long enough to get here," she teased Maggie, then kneeling to dog level. "And these must be the famous boys." Rusty circled suspiciously. "What's the catch?" Shadow already knew. The pieces clicked together. Maggie's late nights at E. The computer, the whispered phone calls about zoning permits, the way she'd started measuring their living room last month. "You bought this?" Shadow breathed. Maggie scratched behind his ears. "We did. The shelter board approved it yesterday." The tour revealed more wonders. Indoor kennels with heated floors for arthritic seniors, a therapy pool for rehabilitation, and most astonishing, a dedicated ambassador wing with 4 adjoining beds and a sign reading, "Resident Experts, Shadow." Rusty, Bolt and Samson Bolt limped excitedly along the fence line. "You mean we live here now? All of us?" Director Callahan laughed. "If you're willing to work, this will be a sanctuary for animals no one else wants. And you 4... She gestured to the rolling fields where future enclosures would stand. "You'll help them learn to trust again." Samson sat at perfect attention, but his wagging tail betrayed him. "A mission," he said solemnly. Rusty flopped onto a sunny patch of floor. "So much work." But the gleam in his eye gave him away. That night they camped out in the unfinished farmhouse, just Maggie and her 4 dogs in a nest of sleeping bags, takeout containers scattered around them. The puppies, no longer small enough to be called that, dozed by the fireplace, exhausted from exploring. Maggie unfolded blueprints in the dim lantern light. "The kennels go here, therapy space here, and this," her finger landed on a shaded area, "is where we'll build your special playground, Shadow. All textures and scents and safe obstacles." Shadow rested his head on her knee. He wanted to say so much about gratitude and belonging and the strange magic of second chances, but the words tangled in his throat. Rusty had no such reservations. "Took you long enough to figure it out," he grumbled, then licked Maggie's hand. Dawn revealed the property's true gift. While the humans drank coffee and pointed at construction plans, the 4 dogs slipped outside. Samson led Bolt to a soft hill where his bad leg wouldn't trouble him. Rusty marked the perimeter with exaggerated care, and Shadow, he stood at the center of it all, the crisp morning air carrying snippets of sound and scent from every direction, the rustle of last autumn's cornstalks, the distant chuckle of a creek, the warm musk of his pack nearby. For a blind dog who'd once huddled starving in an alley, this was more than a home, more than a sanctuary. It was the wide, breathing promise that no animal would ever be left behind again. And as Rusty's familiar limping gait approached from behind, as Samson's disciplined bark organized the puppies, as Bolt's contented sigh carried on the wind, Shadow knew one thing for certain. Their story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The morning of the grand opening dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring day that made even the oldest dogs at Second Chance Ranch feel like puppies again. Shadow stood at the edge of the newly completed sensory garden, his nose twitching as 100 unfamiliar scents swirled around him. Freshly laid mulch, the tang of paint on the new welcome sign, and beneath it all, the electric buzz of human excitement. Rusty limped up beside him, his once bad leg now strong from months of hydrotherapy. "Place looks ridiculous," he grumbled, but the way his tail thumped against Shadow's side betrayed his true feelings. From across the lawn, Maggie's voice carried as she directed last-minute preparations. "No, the ribbon goes on the therapy pool fence, and someone check if Bolt's wearing his ambassador bandana. The news crew wants footage of him demonstrating the obstacle course." A familiar, dignified trot approached. Samson. "Transport van just arrived," the lab reported. "First intake, severe case." Shadow felt Rusty tense beside him. They'd discussed this moment for weeks. Who would greet their first official rescue? In the end, choice was simple. The van doors opened to reveal a steel crate. Inside, a shape so small and broken-looking that Shadow at first mistook it for a pile of rags. Then the pile moved, and 2 milky eyes peered out. A puppy, maybe 4 months old, blind. And if the oozing sores on his paws were any indication, recently escaped from some hellish puppy mill. Maggie made a soft, heartbroken sound. "Oh, little one." Shadow didn't wait for permission. He approached slowly, his own clouded eyes fixed unseeingly on the crate. When he was close enough to feel the puppy's panicked breaths, he lay down, just as Rusty had done for him on that first rainy night years ago. The puppy froze. "Hey," Shadow whispered. A tiny nose twitched, then, miraculously, a shuddering whimper. Shadow glanced over his shoulder at Rusty. The terrier's gaze held all the pride and pain of their journey. With a soft grunt, Rusty joined him, flanking the puppy's other side. "Welcome home, kid," Rusty said. Hours later, when the ribbon had been cut and the cameras had left, Shadow found Rusty watching over the sleeping puppy in the recovery room. The terrier's ears pricked as Shadow approached. "Remember when we were that small?" Rusty mused. Shadow huffed a laugh. "You were never small." They lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the puppy's occasional sleepy twitches. Outside, the sounds of their new life continued, Bolt gently guiding a 3-legged shepherd through the shallow pool, Samson demonstrating proper leash manners to a group of volunteers, Maggie laughing as the now grown puppies, officially dubbed The second chance 6 romped in the play yard. Rusty sighed contentedly. We did good, huh? Shadow leaned against his brother, his best friend, his first and fiercest protector. The words came easily now after all this time. We're just getting started. And as the sun dipped below the farmhouse roof, painting them, both in golden light, the little blind puppy between them sighed in his sleep, safe at last and already dreaming of tomorrow.